There is a particular cruelty to heartbreak that occurs in public, a kind of devastation that multiplies with every pitying glance and whispered comment until the wounded soul feels as though their pain has become entertainment for the masses. And it was precisely this variety of heartbreak that had shaped Lady Eleanor Ashford into the woman she had become at 24 years of age. She possessed the sort of beauty that revealed itself slowly, not the dazzling, obvious prettiness that drew immediate attention in ballrooms, but rather a quiet loveliness found in the intelligence of her grey eyes, the gentle curve of her lips when she smiled, and the graceful way she carried herself even in the most trying circumstances. Her hair was the colour of chestnuts in autumn, rich and warm, and she wore it simply now, without the elaborate styling that had once marked her as a young lady of fashion and prospects. 3 years prior, Eleanor had been engaged to Lord Reginald Blackwood, the Viscount Hartley, a man whose charm had dazzled her young heart and whose promises had painted pictures of a future filled with love and security. She had believed every word that fell from his handsome lips, had treasured every stolen glance across crowded rooms, had counted the days until she would become his wife and begin the life she had dreamed of since girlhood. The engagement had been the triumph of her first season, spoken of with approval by the matrons of society and with envy by the other young ladies who had hoped to catch the Viscount's eye. Eleanor had floated through those months in a haze of happiness, blind to the calculating light that sometimes flickered in Reginald's eyes when he looked at her modest dowry, deaf to the whispers that he had debts mounting faster than his charm could manage. The blow had fallen at the Summerton Ball, the grandest event of the season, where Eleanor had arrived in her finest gown expecting to dance the night away in her betrothed's arms. Instead, she had stood frozen in the centre of the ballroom as Reginald announced, with devastating casualness, that their engagement was at an end, that he had found a bride whose fortune was more suited to his needs, and that he wished Eleanor well in her future endeavours. The silence that followed had been absolute, a vacuum of sound that seemed to stretch for eternity before the whispers began, and Eleanor had felt every eye in the room upon her as her world crumbled into dust at her silk-slippered feet. In the 3 years since that catastrophic evening, Eleanor had retreated from society entirely, finding neither the heart nor the means to continue participating in a world that had witnessed her humiliation. Her family's finances, never robust, had declined steadily as her father's health failed, and she had devoted herself to his care at their modest country estate, selling off treasures piece by piece to pay for physicians and medicines, watching the comfortable life she had known slowly diminish into genteel poverty. She no longer dreamed of love or ballrooms or handsome suitors. She dreamed only of her father's recovery and of somehow keeping their small household intact for another month, another season, another year. Alexander Ashworth, the Duke of Thornwood, had earned his fearsome reputation through 5 years of relentless coldness, and all of England knew him by the name whispered in drawing-rooms and gentlemen's clubs alike. The Stone Duke, a man whose heart had turned to granite and whose gaze could freeze the boldest debutante mid-curtsy. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples and eyes the colour of a winter storm, grey and penetrating and utterly without warmth when they surveyed the world around him. His face might have been handsome once, and indeed still possessed the strong bones and commanding features that drew reluctant glances from ladies who knew better than to hope. But it was a face that had forgotten how to smile, a face that wore severity like armour against any who might seek to breach the walls he had built around himself. 5 years ago, Alexander had been a different man, a man capable of laughter and tenderness, a man who had married a sweet young woman named Catherine and had dared to dream of a future filled with children and contentment and the quiet joys of domestic happiness. Catherine had been gentle and good, a wife who adored him, even if their match had been arranged by their families rather than sparked by passionate love, and Alexander had cared for her deeply, had looked forward to growing old beside her, had felt his heart swell when she told him she carried his child. But fate, that cruelest of mistresses, had snatched away every hope in a single terrible night when Catherine's labour went wrong, when the physicians shook their heads with grave faces, when Alexander paced the halls of Thornwood, listening to screams that gradually faded into a silence far more horrible than any sound. She died with the dawn, his young wife, and their son, perfect and tiny, and never given the chance to draw breath, died with her, and Alexander had stood at their graves in the family cemetery and sworn upon everything he held sacred that he would never love again, that he would never again give fate the opportunity to destroy him so completely. In the years since that black morning, Alexander had retreated to his vast estate on the isolated moors, a sprawling Gothic manor called Thornwood Hall that suited his temperament perfectly with its grey stone walls and wind-swept grounds and the ever-present mist that rolled across the heather. He conducted his business affairs with ruthless efficiency, multiplying his already considerable fortune through investments and shrewd management, and he rejected every matchmaking attempt with such icy disdain that mothers eventually stopped trying, warning their daughters that the Duke of Thornwood was not merely unavailable, but dangerous in his detachment. Society feared him, servants trembled before him, and even his own relations kept their distance, save for his cousin Marcus, whose eyes gleamed with barely concealed avarice as he waited for the Duke to die without an heir, so that the title and fortune might pass to him. Alexander cared nothing for any of it, not the whispers, not the fear, not the loneliness that sometimes crept upon him in the darkest hours of the night, for he had made his choice, had sealed his heart away where nothing and no one could ever touch it again, and he intended to keep that vow until his dying day. The autumn storm descended upon the countryside with a fury that seemed almost personal, as though the heavens themselves had determined to unleash every drop of rain and every gust of wind they possessed upon the winding roads and rolling hills of the English moors, and it was into this tempest that Lady Eleanor Ashford found herself travelling, alone in a hired coach that creaked and groaned with each violent sway. She had spent the morning in the village of Ashcroft, some 30 miles from her father's estate, conducting business that had broken her heart, even as necessity demanded she complete it, the sale of her mother's last remaining jewels, a delicate set of pearls and a ruby brooch that had been promised to Eleanor on her wedding day, a day that had never come and now never would. The jeweller had been kind, offering her a fair price and averting his eyes from the tears she could not quite suppress as she signed the papers and accepted the small pouch of coins that would pay for another month of her father's medications, another month of keeping the creditors at bay, another month of the slow diminishment of everything she had once known and loved. The storm had begun as she departed the village, first as a gentle rain that pattered against the coach windows, then as a driving downpour that reduced visibility to mere feet, and finally as a howling gale that sent branches crashing across the road and turned the packed dirt into treacherous rivers of mud. Eleanor gripped the worn velvet seat as the coach lurched violently, her heart pounding against her ribs as she heard the coachman's shouted curses above the roar of the wind, and then came the sound she had dreaded, a sharp crack, a sickening lurch to one side, and the grinding halt of wheels that would turn no more. The coach door flew open, revealing the coachman's rain-streaked face, pale with fear as he shouted that the wheel had shattered, that they were stranded on the moors with night falling fast, that he would take one of the horses and ride for help while she remained with the coach. Before Eleanor could protest, before she could point out the madness of leaving a woman alone on a deserted road in such weather, he had unhitched the stronger of the 2 horses and vanished into the sheeting rain, leaving her with nothing but the howling wind and the growing darkness and the terrible knowledge that she might well perish here, alone and unmourned, on this God-forsaken stretch of road. She climbed from the ruined coach, her travelling dress immediately soaked through, her carefully pinned hair torn loose by the grasping wind, and it was then that she saw it alight in the distance, golden and steady against the grey fury of the storm, emanating from what appeared to be a great house perched upon a rise in the moors. Eleanor knew these lands, knew them by reputation if not by direct experience, and her heart seized with a different kind of fear as she recognized where fate had stranded her within walking distance of Thornwood Hall, the domain of the Stone Duke himself, a man whose name was spoken in whispers and whose hospitality was extended to no one. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and the darkness was falling fast, and Eleanor Ashford had not survived 3 years of heartbreak and hardship, only to die of stubbornness on a muddy road. And so she gathered her sodden skirts and began to walk toward the light, toward the fearsome master of the moors, toward a destiny she could not yet begin to imagine. The massive oak doors of Thornwood Hall loomed before Eleanor like the gates of some ancient fortress, dark and imposing and seemingly impervious to the desperate knocking of a rain-soaked woman whose strength was failing her with each passing moment, and yet she pounded upon them with what remained of her resolve, knowing that to turn back now would mean certain death upon the merciless moors. For what felt like an eternity there was no response, only the howling wind and the driving rain, and the terrible fear that she had come all this way, only to be denied sanctuary. But then she heard footsteps approaching, heard the grinding of iron bolts being drawn back, and the door opened just enough to reveal the stern face of an elderly butler, whose expression conveyed quite clearly that unexpected visitors were neither welcomed nor tolerated at Thornwood Hall. "The master receives no callers," the butler intoned, his voice as cold as the rain that streamed down Eleanor's face, and he began to close the door even as she stammered out an explanation of her circumstances, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to be heard before she was cast back into the storm. "Mr. Graves, what is the meaning of this commotion?" The voice that cut through the howling wind was deep and commanding, and Eleanor looked past the butler to see a figure emerging from the shadows of the great hall, a tall and broad-shouldered man whose very presence seemed to still the air around him, whose grey eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her forget, for just a moment, how cold she was and how frightened she had been. This, she knew with absolute certainty, was the Duke of Thornwood himself, the stone Duke of legend, and he was studying her with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts, as his gaze travelled over her bedraggled appearance, her ruined dress, her hair plastered to her pale cheeks by the relentless rain. Eleanor straightened her spine despite her shivers, meeting his gaze with what dignity she could muster, for she had learned in the bitter years since her humiliation that cowering before those who held power over her circumstances gained her nothing but their contempt, and she would not give this formidable man the satisfaction of seeing her grovel. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect, "I am Lady Eleanor Ashford, and I find myself stranded upon your road due to a broken coach wheel, and I humbly beg shelter from this storm until morning." Something flickered in those winter-grey eyes, something that might have been surprise or perhaps curiosity, though it vanished so quickly, Eleanor could not be certain she had seen it at all. For a long moment he simply looked at her, this man who was said to have no heart, and Eleanor held his gaze without flinching, refusing to drop her eyes or beg more than she already had. "Let her in, Graves," the Duke said at last, his voice dismissive and cold, and he turned away without another word, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had emerged. Eleanor stepped across the threshold of Thornwood Hall, water pooling around her ruined shoes, and as the great doors closed behind her with a resonant boom, she could not shake the feeling that she had just crossed into a world from which there might be no easy return. The storm raged on beyond those first desperate hours, howling across the moors with an intensity that showed no signs of abating, and Eleanor found herself trapped within the grand and lonely halls of Thornwood Hall for not one night but 3, watching the rain lash against windows that seemed to stretch toward the heavens, and feeling the ancient house shudder beneath each gust of wind that swept down from the hills. She had been given a guest chamber of unexpected elegance, its furnishings rich if somewhat faded, its fireplace kept blazing by servants who moved through the house like ghosts, speaking little and watching her with curious eyes that suggested visitors to this isolated place were rare indeed. Eleanor explored what portions of the house seemed open to her, wandering through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, through drawing rooms shrouded in dust covers, through a magnificent library that took her breath away, with its towering shelves and leather-bound treasures, and everywhere she went, she sensed the profound loneliness that permeated these walls, as though the very stones mourned something precious that had been lost. She encountered the Duke at meals, for he insisted with gruff formality that she join him in the cavernous dining room rather than take her meals alone, and these dinners passed in stilted conversation that seemed to cost him considerable effort, his responses clipped and his grey eyes guarded, though Eleanor noticed that he ensured her plate was always filled with the choicest portions, and her wine-glass never sat empty. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the kindly housekeeper whose round face and warm manner stood in stark contrast to the coldness of her master, who finally illuminated the shadows that hung over Thornwood Hall, speaking in hushed tones as she helped Eleanor dress one morning of the young Duchess who had died 5 years past, of the infant heir who had never drawn breath, of the way the master had sealed himself away from the world and from his own heart, becoming the stone duke that all of England whispered about, with mingled fear and fascination. Eleanor felt something shift within her chest as she absorbed this knowledge, an unexpected sympathy for the formidable man who took his meals in silence and walked the corridors of his empty house alone, and she found herself watching him with new eyes, seeing not coldness but grief, not cruelty but a wound that had never been allowed to heal. And though she did not know it, could not have guessed it from his impassive countenance, Alexander was watching her as well, noting the way she thanked the servants with genuine warmth, the way she handled the books in his library with reverent care, the way she neither cowered before his reputation nor sought to charm him with feminine wiles, and something long dormant stirred beneath the ice around his heart, something he refused to name but could not entirely suppress. Alexander had made discreet inquiries, as was his nature, for he was not a man who tolerated mysteries within his own domain, and what he learned of Lady Eleanor Ashford painted a portrait that stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, something that felt dangerously like compassion for this woman who had been publicly humiliated by a man unworthy to speak her name, whose family had fallen from comfort into genteel poverty, whose father lay dying while she sold her mother's jewels to pay for physicians who could offer nothing but temporary comfort. He told himself his interest was merely practical, that any gentleman would wish to understand the circumstances of an unexpected guest, but he found himself dwelling on the details far longer than practicality required, found himself watching her with an attention he had not paid to another soul in 5 long years. On the second evening of her enforced stay, he discovered her in his library, curled into the leather chair by the fire, with a volume of Wordsworth's poetry open upon her lap, and he paused in the doorway to observe her unnoticed, struck by the way the firelight played across her features as she read, by the genuine absorption in her expression that spoke of a mind engaged rather than a woman merely passing time. She was not reading the fashionable novels that ladies of society devoured and discussed in breathless tones, not perusing volumes of gossip or romantic fancy, but rather she had found his collection of philosophy and verse, the books he himself treasured, and she handled them with the reverence of one who understood their worth. He must have made some sound, for she looked up suddenly, and rather than the startled guilt he might have expected, she met his gaze with calm directness, closing the book with care but making no move to flee his presence. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice that pleasant low melody he found himself straining to hear at meals. "I could not resist the temptation of such a magnificent library, though I should have asked permission before making free with your books." He found himself entering the room rather than retreating, found himself settling into the chair opposite hers, as though this were the most natural thing in the world, and when he spoke his voice was less cold than he intended. "You have chosen well," he observed, nodding toward the Wordsworth, "though I confess I am surprised to find a lady of your years preferring poetry to more popular entertainments." The conversation that followed was unlike any Alexander had experienced since his self-imposed exile from emotional connection, for Eleanor spoke to him not as a supplicant seeking favor, nor as a matchmaking mama angling for a title, but as an equal whose mind had been sharpened by solitude and sorrow into something fine and keen, and he found himself offering opinions he had shared with no one, debating interpretations of verse, lingering far longer than propriety suggested, while the fire burned low and the storm howled beyond the windows, drawn inexorably to the quiet strength in her bearing and the sadness in her sapphire eyes that echoed the grief he saw each morning in his own mirror. On the 4th morning, Eleanor woke to silence, a silence so profound after 3 days of howling wind and driving rain that she lay motionless for several moments, uncertain whether she was still dreaming, before she rose and crossed to the window to find the storm had passed at last, leaving the moors washed clean and glistening beneath a pale autumn sun that seemed almost apologetic for its long absence. She dressed with care, her borrowed gown for Mrs. Pemberton had insisted on providing fresh clothing, while her own was cleaned and mended, feeling strange against her skin, and she descended to the breakfast room with a peculiar heaviness in her chest that she refused to examine too closely, telling herself it was merely anxiety about the journey ahead and the troubles waiting for her at home, certainly not reluctance to leave this lonely house and its enigmatic master. Alexander was already present when she entered, standing by the window with his back to the room, and he turned at the sound of her footsteps with an expression she could not read, his grey eyes studying her face as though searching for something he could not name. "The roads will be passable by midday," he said without preamble, his voice carrying that familiar, cool formality. "I have arranged for my own carriage to convey you home." as your hired coach proved so singularly unreliable." Eleanor thanked him with the quiet grace that had become habitual between them, but before she could speak further, he raised a hand to forestall her words, and something in his bearing shifted, a tension entering his broad shoulders that suggested he was about to say something that cost him considerable effort. "Before you depart," he said, the words emerging slowly as though each one required deliberate selection, "I would speak with you on a matter of some importance, a proposition that may strike you as irregular, but which I ask you to consider with the same practical intelligence you have demonstrated throughout your unexpected sojourn in my home." Eleanor's heart began to beat with uncomfortable rapidity, though she kept her expression composed, and she inclined her head in silent invitation for him to continue. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary conversation of her life, delivered in Alexander's measured tones, with all the warmth of a business negotiation, yet containing within it the seeds of her entire future transformed. He required an heir, he explained, for without one his estate and title would pass to a cousin whose cruelty and dissipation would destroy everything generations of Ashworths had built. She required security, financial stability, protection from a world that had treated her with callous disregard. He proposed a marriage of convenience, an arrangement of mutual benefit in which she would receive the full protection of his name and fortune. Her father would have access to the finest physicians money could procure, and she would want for nothing material for the remainder of her days. In return, she would provide him with the heir duty demanded and the companionship of an intelligent woman whose presence he found, he admitted with obvious difficulty, considerably less objectionable than he had anticipated. There would be no pretense of romantic attachment, no expectations of affection beyond mutual respect, no demands upon her heart, which he understood had been wounded by one who proved unworthy of her regard. Eleanor listened in silence, her mind racing through calculations of practicality and pride, weighing the security he offered against the dreams of love she had long since abandoned as childish fancy. And when she finally spoke her acceptance, her voice was steady and her reasoning sound, for she saw in his proposal nothing more than sensible rescue from an impossible situation, and he saw in her acceptance nothing more than the fulfillment of duty long deferred. Neither acknowledged, even to themselves, the relief that flooded through them at the prospect of continued proximity, nor the way their eyes met and held for just a moment longer than mere business required, for both were accomplished in the art of self-deception, and both believed with perfect sincerity that this arrangement had nothing whatsoever to do with the heart. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in the small chapel at Thornwood Hall with only the vicar, the household staff, and Eleanor's frail father in attendance, the latter having been transported with the utmost care in Alexander's most comfortable carriage and installed in a sunny guest chamber, where physicians attended him round the clock, and as Eleanor spoke her vows in a steady voice, she told herself that the flutter in her chest was merely nervousness at the solemnity of the occasion, and nothing whatsoever to do with the way Alexander's grey eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. She moved into her new home as the Duchess of Thornwood, a title that felt strange upon her tongue, and stranger still when the servants addressed her with deep curtsies and respectful murmurs, and in those first weeks she wandered the great house like a ghost, learning its corridors and chambers, discovering rooms that had stood unused for years, their furniture draped in holland covers and their windows shuttered against the light, as though the entire estate had been holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to breathe life back into its bones. Eleanor could not bear the darkness, the oppressive weight of grief that hung in every shadowed corner, and so she began, tentatively at first, and then, with growing confidence, to make small changes that transformed the character of her new home, without presuming to erase its history, ordering the curtains thrown open each morning to admit the pale autumn sunlight, directing the gardener to cut fresh flowers for the public rooms, ensuring that fires burned bright in hearths that had long stood cold. And gradually the house began to warm, not merely in temperature but in spirit, as though it were slowly awakening from a long and troubled sleep. Alexander observed these changes with an expression Eleanor could not decipher, his grey eyes following the vases of chrysanthemums that appeared on tables, the soft throw blankets she draped over chairs in the library, the way she rearranged the sitting room to catch the afternoon light, and though he said nothing of approval or disapproval, she noticed that he lingered longer in rooms she had touched, that his step seemed lighter when he passed through hallways, brightened by her quiet influence. Their evenings fell into a pattern that Eleanor found surprisingly comfortable. Dinner taken together in the smaller dining room, rather than the cavernous, formal hall. Conversations that began with stilted pleasantries and gradually extended into discussions of books and music and the management of the estate. And she discovered that beneath his forbidding exterior, Alexander possessed a dry wit that emerged unexpectedly, and a depth of knowledge on subjects ranging from agricultural innovation to classical philosophy. She noticed, too, the small attentions he paid her without comment or expectation of gratitude, the way her favorite tea appeared at breakfast, though she had mentioned her preference only once, the shawl that materialized on her chair when the evenings grew cool, the standing order he had given that any book she desired should be procured, regardless of cost or rarity. And these quiet acts of consideration touched her more deeply than grand gestures ever could, for they spoke of a man who watched and remembered, who cared for her comfort in ways that required no acknowledgement, and she began to suspect that the Stone Duke was perhaps not so impervious to feeling as the world believed. It was during her third week as Duchess that Eleanor discovered the locked door on the eastern wing's uppermost floor, a heavy oak barrier that stood apart from all the others in the house by virtue of the brass key that remained perpetually turned in its lock, and the way the servants' eyes slid away when she inquired about it, their answers vague murmurs about storage and disuse that told her nothing and everything at once. And she understood without being told that behind that door lay the nursery Alexander had sealed away 5 years ago, the room that had been prepared with such hope for a son who never drew breath, and she honored his grief by never attempting to enter, never pressing for explanations, simply acknowledging the locked door as she passed it each day with a silent respect for wounds that had not yet healed and perhaps never fully would. Instead, she turned her attention to the neglected gardens that sprawled behind the great house, once magnificent formal arrangements that had fallen into wild disrepair, the rose bushes grown leggy and tangled, the hedges losing their careful shapes, the flower beds choked with weeds that had been allowed to flourish unchecked for years, and she found in this work a purpose that satisfied something deep within her soul, spending hours in the autumn chill with dirt beneath her fingernails and an old apron protecting her gowns, directing the gardeners in their efforts while contributing her own labor alongside them in a manner that scandalized Mrs. Pemberton but seemed to amuse Alexander when he watched her from his study window, which she pretended not to notice, though her heart quickened each time she glimpsed his tall figure standing motionless behind the glass. The evening she found him in the rain came without warning, a cold October drizzle that had begun after dinner and continued past nightfall, and Eleanor had been reading in the library when some instinct she could not name drew her to the window overlooking the rear grounds, where she saw him standing utterly still before the small family cemetery enclosed by its iron fence, his dark coat slowly darkening further with moisture, his head bowed in what could only be grief or prayer or some terrible combination of both, and she did not think, did not hesitate, simply retrieved his heavy greatcoat from the entrance hall and walked out into the rain to stand beside him before the 2 small headstones that bore names. She had never heard him speak aloud. She did not offer words of comfort, for she understood instinctively that words would be unwelcome, would shatter whatever communion he was holding with the memories of those he had lost, and so she simply draped the coat around his shoulders and stood silently at his side, the rain soaking through her own shawl and gown while she waited for nothing in particular, demanding nothing, expecting nothing, simply present in his moment of private anguish as a witness and companion rather than an intruder. When at last he turned to look at her, his grey eyes held something she had never seen there before, not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it, but rather a kind of wonder, as though she had given him a gift he had not known he needed, and when he offered her his arm to walk back to the house, his hand covered hers briefly in a gesture that spoke more eloquently than any words he might have summoned, and Eleanor felt the walls between them shift and resettle into a new configuration that neither of them yet had courage to name. The change came gradually, so subtly that Eleanor could not have identified the precise moment when Alexander began seeking her company, rather than merely tolerating it, but she became aware over the following weeks that he appeared more frequently in the rooms she occupied, that he lingered after dinner to continue their conversations, that he sought her out in the library or the morning room with questions about estate matters that she suspected he could have resolved quite easily on his own. asking her opinion on tenant disputes and agricultural improvements and the renovation of cottages on the far reaches of his land. And though she demurred at first, protesting that she knew nothing of such things, he insisted that her perspective was valuable, that her practical mind and compassionate nature offered insights his stewards could not provide, and she found herself drawn into the management of Thornwood in ways she had never anticipated, her days filled with purpose and her evenings filled with discussions that ranged far beyond the boundaries of mere duty. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon that he presented her with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple string, his manner so carefully casual that she knew at once the gift held significance he was unwilling to acknowledge. And when she opened it, to discover a first edition of William Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, its leather binding supple with age, and its pages bearing the foxing of decades, she could not speak for the emotion that closed her throat, remembering only vaguely mentioning her love of Wordsworth during one of their early dinners, weeks ago, a passing comment she herself had forgotten but which he had apparently treasured and acted upon, and the realization that he had been listening so carefully, remembering so faithfully, caring enough to procure a volume that must have required considerable effort to locate, moved her more profoundly than diamonds or rubies ever could have done. The letter arrived 3 days later, brought by a rider from her family's estate, bearing news that her father had taken a turn for the worse, his breathing labored and his fever climbing despite the efforts of the local physician, and Eleanor was preparing to order a carriage when Alexander intercepted her in the hallway, having somehow already learned of the correspondence's contents, informing her quietly that his own physician, Dr. Hartwell, was already en route, having departed at dawn with instructions to spare no effort and no expense in ensuring Lord Ashford's comfort and recovery. She stared at him in astonishment, unable to comprehend how he had known, when he had arranged it, what had prompted such swift and generous action on behalf of a man he had met only once, and he seemed almost uncomfortable beneath her gaze, muttering something about it being a small matter, easily managed, nothing that required thanks. But Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes nonetheless, recognizing in this gesture not the cold calculation of a duke protecting his dynastic interests, but the genuine kindness of a man who cared about her happiness, who had noticed her worry and moved to alleviate it before she had even asked. And in that moment she acknowledged to herself what she had been desperately trying to deny, that she was falling in love with her husband, falling in love with a man who had sworn never to love again, and she was utterly terrified of the heartbreak that surely awaited her when he could not, would not, return what she so foolishly longed to offer. The announcement came on a grey November morning, delivered with Alexander's characteristic directness over breakfast, his voice carefully neutral, as he informed Eleanor that they would be attending the autumn ball in London the following week, their first public appearance as husband and wife before the assembled scrutiny of the ton, and Eleanor felt her teacup tremble slightly in her hand as the implications washed over her, the whispers that would follow her, the measuring gazes of matrons who remembered her disgrace, the possibility of encountering those who had witnessed her humiliation 3 years past, and who would now judge whether she had risen or merely fallen into different circumstances. And though she nodded her acceptance with outward composure, Alexander seemed to read the anxiety beneath her calm facade, for he added, almost gruffly, that arrangements had been made for a new wardrobe befitting her station, and that she need not concern herself with preparations beyond selecting what pleased her from the options his solicitors would arrange. The modiste arrived 2 days later, a formidable Frenchwoman named Madame Beaumont, who had dressed duchesses and countesses throughout her illustrious career, bringing with her bolts of fabric in every conceivable shade and an army of seamstresses who measured and pinned and draped until Eleanor felt more like a dressmaker's form than a living woman. Yet the gowns that emerged from this flurry of activity were unlike anything she had ever worn, elegant confections that somehow managed to be both fashionable and perfectly suited to her quiet beauty, neither too bold nor too retiring, and when the final piece arrived, a gown of midnight blue silk that shimmered like starlight on water. Eleanor could scarcely believe the woman who looked back at her from the mirror was truly herself. The sapphires came on the evening of the ball itself, presented in a velvet case that Alexander handed to her with an expression she could not quite decipher, and when she opened it to discover a necklace of gems so deeply blue they seemed to hold the night sky within their depths, surrounded by diamonds that caught the candlelight like scattered stars, her breath caught in her throat, and she could find no words adequate to express what stirred within her chest, managing only a whispered thank you that seemed woefully insufficient for such magnificence, and Alexander merely nodded, his grey eyes intent upon her face as though memorizing her reaction, before departing to allow her to complete her preparations. When Eleanor descended the grand staircase of Thornwood Hall that evening, the midnight silk rustling softly with each step and the sapphires glowing against her pale skin, she saw Alexander waiting at the bottom, resplendent in formal black evening attire, and she watched something shift in his expression, a slight parting of his lips, a momentary stillness, a flicker in those grey eyes that she might have called wonder if she had dared to name it, before he composed himself and offered his arm with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his stern reputation, his voice low and oddly rough, as he told her that she had nothing to fear this evening, that she would outshine every woman present without effort, that anyone who failed to recognize her worth revealed only their own deficiency. And though Eleanor suspected he meant these words as mere reassurance, the intensity with which he spoke them, the way his hand covered hers on his arm as he led her to the waiting carriage, suggested something far deeper than social courtesy, something that made her heart pound with terrified hope as they departed into the night toward whatever awaited them in London's glittering ballrooms. The ballroom blazed with 10,000 candles reflected in gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers, and Eleanor felt every eye turn toward them as she and Alexander descended the grand staircase into the glittering assembly, the weight of society's scrutiny pressing upon her like a physical force as whispers rippled through the crowd. The Stone Duke and his mysterious bride, the woman who had somehow captured the most elusive bachelor in England, the former almost viscountess whose broken engagement had provided such delicious gossip 3 seasons past, and she held herself with all the dignity she could summon, her chin lifted and her hand steady upon Alexander's arm, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her as they navigated the sea of curious faces and calculating gazes, moving through the obligatory greetings and introductions with a grace that surprised even herself, and she was beginning to believe she might survive this evening unscathed when she saw him across the ballroom, Lord Reginald Blackwood, still handsome in that superficial way that had once captivated her foolish younger heart, his wife beside him draped in jewels that could not disguise the bitter downturn of her mouth or the unhappiness that shadowed her eyes, and Eleanor felt her composure waver for just a moment before she steeled herself, turning away as though she had not noticed him at all. But Reginald had never been one to allow a slight to pass unremarked, and within minutes he had maneuvered himself into their path, his smile sharp with malice as he offered an exaggerated bow, and remarked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear that he was simply astonished to see dear Eleanor looking so well, that he had not realized the Duke collected charity cases along with his other antiquities, that he supposed even the Stone Duke might grow desperate enough to marry any convenient female who happened to appear on his doorstep. And the words struck Eleanor like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to remind her of her place, to reduce her once again to the humiliated girl he had discarded. But before she could formulate any response, Alexander's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade of ice, cold and precise and devastating in its controlled fury, as he informed Lord Blackwood that he found it remarkable that a man drowning in gambling debts to half the clubs in London, a man whose wife's fortune had been squandered on opera dancers and cards within 2 years of their marriage, a man whose own father had publicly lamented his son's lack of character, would dare to speak of charity, or desperation, or the worth of any lady present, let alone the Duchess of Thornwood, and the ballroom had fallen utterly silent now, every ear straining to catch each word as Alexander continued, his voice carrying clearly through the frozen assembly, as he declared that he had not married Eleanor Ashford out of pity or convenience, but out of the profound recognition that she possessed more grace, more intelligence, more genuine worth in her smallest gesture than Reginald Blackwood could comprehend in a lifetime of shallow pursuits, that he counted himself the most fortunate man in England to call her his wife, and that anyone who offered insult to him and would be dealt with accordingly. And Reginald had gone pale as parchment, stammering some inadequate response before retreating with his mortified wife into the crowd, and Eleanor stood trembling beside her husband as the ballroom slowly returned to life around them, the whispers now carrying an entirely different tone, wonder, respect, and the delicious satisfaction of witnessing a villain receive his due, while Alexander guided her toward the refreshment room with a hand that shook almost imperceptibly against the small of her back. The carriage ride home passed in a silence that felt weighted with unspoken things. The rhythmic clatter of hooves against cobblestones and the gentle sway of the vehicle, the only accompaniments to Eleanor's tumultuous thoughts as she sat across from Alexander in the velvet-cushioned darkness, still trembling from what had transpired in that glittering ballroom, her mind replaying his words over and over again: the finest lady in England, the most fortunate man, anyone who offered her insult, offered insult to him. Words spoken not in private whispers, but declared before the assembled cream of society. Words that had silenced every cruel tongue and transformed the pitying glances she had dreaded into expressions of genuine respect and even envy. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged small and wondering as she thanked him, though the inadequacy of those two simple words to convey the enormity of what he had done pressed heavily upon her chest, and Alexander seemed almost startled by her gratitude, his expression flickering with something that might have been embarrassment as he shifted in his seat and replied gruffly that any gentleman would have done the same, that Blackwood's behavior was inexcusable and required correction, that she need not make more of it than it was. But even as he spoke these dismissive words, his hand reached across the space between them and covered hers where it lay upon her lap, his fingers warm and strong as they curled around her own, and the touch, the first, deliberate, tender contact they had shared in all their weeks of marriage, sent a shock of sensation through Eleanor's entire body, a current of feeling so intense that she could scarcely breathe, and she saw his own sharp intake of breath, saw the way his eyes found hers in the dim lamplight filtering through the carriage windows, saw something raw and unguarded flash across his features before he composed himself once more. Yet he did not release her hand, and they travelled the remainder of the distance to their London townhouse in that electric connection, palm pressed to palm, neither willing to break the fragile bridge they had somehow constructed between them. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her guest chamber, the sapphires returned to their velvet case but still burning against her memory like brands, and she could no longer maintain the careful fiction she had constructed around her own heart, the pretense that this marriage was merely practical, merely safe, merely a sensible arrangement between two wounded souls seeking shelter from a world that had hurt them both. For the truth blazed through her with undeniable clarity. She loved him, loved this stern and broken man who had defended her honor with such fierce devotion, loved the tender gestures hidden beneath his cold exterior, loved the way he remembered small details she mentioned and acted upon them without fanfare, loved every fractured piece of him that he kept so carefully guarded from the world. And the recognition of her own feelings terrified her more than any social humiliation ever could, because she had sworn to herself that she would never again be vulnerable to a man's power over her heart. In his own chambers, Alexander paced before the dying fire, his cravat discarded and his hands clenched as he confronted the ruins of every vow he had made in the dark days after Margaret's death, when he had knelt beside two graves and promised the cold earth that he would never again permit another soul to hold such devastating power over his happiness, that he would armor himself in stone and ice and remain forever impervious to the particular devastation that love inevitably wrought. Yet here he stood, undone by a woman who had appeared on his doorstep in a storm, a woman who asked nothing of him, yet had somehow claimed everything. The days following the ball brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere between them, as though the events of that glittering evening had cracked open a door that neither had previously dared to approach, and Eleanor found Alexander seeking her company with increasing frequency, appearing in the morning room where she took her breakfast, suggesting walks through the frost-touched gardens, lingering after dinner in the drawing-room, rather than retreating immediately to his study, as had been his custom. And it was on one such evening, as they sat before the fire with glasses of wine and the comfortable silence that had become familiar between them, that he began to speak of Margaret, his first wife, a girl of 17 when they married. Sweet-natured and gentle, and utterly unprepared for the isolation of Thornwood Hall, a match arranged by their families that he had accepted out of duty rather than passion, and Eleanor listened without interruption as he described how he had cared for Margaret genuinely, had tried to make her happy, had felt responsible for her contentment, even as he recognized that the deep, consuming love poets wrote of had never existed between them, and when she died in that terrible night of blood and anguish, Taking their infant son with her into the darkness, he had been devastated not only by grief but by guilt, by the crushing weight of wondering whether he had somehow failed her, whether a husband who truly loved his wife might have saved her through the sheer force of his devotion, and he had built his walls of stone not merely against future pain, but against the possibility that he might once again prove insufficient to protect someone who depended upon him. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she listened, understanding now the depth of the wounds he carried, and when he fell silent, staring into the flames with an expression of such raw vulnerability that it made her chest ache, she found herself sharing her own story, in turn how Reginald's betrayal had not merely humiliated her publicly, but had shattered something essential in her understanding of herself, how she had believed his pretty words and charming smiles, had built dreams upon foundations of sand, had trusted her own judgment only to discover it catastrophically flawed, and how in the aftermath she had concluded that she was somehow unworthy of genuine love, that there must be some fundamental lack in her that made her easy to discard when a better option presented itself. And Alexander's response was immediate and fierce, his voice rough with emotion, as he declared that Reginald Blackwood was a fool of the highest order, that any man who could look at Eleanor and see anything less than extraordinary was blind beyond redemption, that her worth was evident in every word she spoke and every action she took, and the intensity in his eyes as he said these words made Eleanor's heart race in her chest, made her breath come shallow and quick, made her achingly aware of how close they sat upon the settee, and how easy it would be to reach across and touch him. The following afternoon they walked together through the gardens she had been restoring, the autumn roses still clinging to their last blooms despite the advancing cold, and as they paused beside the fountain she had coaxed back to life, their hands brushed against each other, and neither pulled away, and they stood there in the golden light of the setting sun, fingers almost intertwined, the distance between what they were and what they might become narrowing with every shared glance and unspoken word. The letter arrived on a grey morning when frost still clung to the window-panes of Thornwood Hall, delivered by a messenger who had ridden through the night from the modest estate where Eleanor's father had spent his final months in comfort, thanks to Alexander's physician, and the funds that had flowed quietly and without fanfare to ensure his care, and Eleanor knew before she broke the seal what words awaited her within, for she had felt a strange heaviness in her heart upon waking, a premonition of loss that settled into certainty as her eyes moved across the careful script, informing her that Lord Ashford had passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the nurses Alexander had provided, his final words a blessing for his daughter and gratitude for the happiness she had found. And Eleanor sat very still for a long moment, the letter trembling in her hands, before the grief she had been holding at bay for so many months finally broke through the walls of her composure, and she wept not the delicate, pretty tears that society deemed appropriate for a lady, but deep, racking sobs that shook her entire frame as she mourned not only her father, but the last connection to her former life, the final thread linking her to the girl she had been before. Storms and stone dukes and unexpected love had transformed her utterly. She did not know how long she sat there in the library, curled into the window seat where she so often read, her face buried in her hands and her shoulders heaving with the weight of her sorrow, but at some point she became aware that she was no longer alone, that the door had opened and closed with quiet discretion, that footsteps had crossed the carpet toward her, and then, miracle of miracles, strong arms wrapped around her, gathering her against a broad chest that smelled of sandalwood and wood smoke, and something uniquely Alexander, and he held her without speaking, without offering platitudes or empty comfort, simply present and solid and warm as she poured her grief into the fine wool of his coat, and Eleanor clung to him with a desperation that would have embarrassed her had she possessed the capacity for any emotion beyond the overwhelming need to be held by this man who had somehow become the center of her entire world. When at last her tears subsided into shuddering breaths and occasional hiccups, Alexander pressed a handkerchief into her hands, monogrammed, immaculate, utterly his, and still he did not release her, keeping one arm firmly around her shoulders as though he feared she might shatter if he let go. And Eleanor whispered her thanks, apologizing for her display, for dampening his jacket, for being so terribly weak, and Alexander's response was immediate and fierce as he told her that grief was not weakness, that loving one's father enough to mourn him deeply was a testament to her character, that she need never apologize to him for feeling, And then his voice grew quieter, rougher, as he added that her happiness had become important to him, more important than he had anticipated when he proposed their practical arrangement, more important than he could easily express in words that always seemed inadequate to the task. And Eleanor looked up at him through tear-spiked lashes and saw in his grey eyes a tenderness that stole her breath, and she understood that in her moment of greatest sorrow she had found her anchor, her harbour, her home. A week had passed since they laid her father to rest in the small churchyard near the family estate, a week in which Eleanor had moved through the rituals of mourning with the quiet dignity that had become her armour against the world. And throughout those 7 days Alexander had remained a constant presence at her side, not intrusive, never demanding, simply there in the way that mattered most. Ensuring she ate when grief stole her appetite, sitting with her in companionable silence when words felt impossible, handling the endless correspondence and arrangements so that she might grieve without the burden of practicality weighing upon her shoulders. And it was on the morning of the 8th day that he found her in the breakfast room and asked, with an uncertainty she had never before heard in his voice, whether she might walk with him that afternoon, for there was something he wished to say and a particular place where he wished to say it. And Eleanor agreed without question, her heart beating strangely in her chest at the expression she glimpsed in his grey eyes before he looked away. The afternoon was crisp and golden, autumn yielding reluctantly to winter's approach, and Alexander led her not toward the gardens or the moorland paths they had walked together so many times before, but toward the front of the great house, toward the massive oak doors where fate had first brought her to him on that tempestuous night that seemed both a lifetime ago and mere moments past. And when they stood together in that threshold, the very spot where she had appeared bedraggled and desperate and utterly unaware that she was knocking on the door to her entire future, Alexander turned to face her with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat, vulnerability and determination warring in the lines of his handsome face. He began to speak, and his words came haltingly, imperfectly, as though each one cost him tremendous effort to release into the space between them. He told her that he had made a vow 5 years ago, standing beside 2 graves that held everything he thought he had left to lose, a vow that he would never again allow himself to love, never again risk the devastation of having his heart shattered by forces beyond his control, and he had kept that vow faithfully through all the empty years that followed, had built walls of stone around himself so high and so thick that he believed nothing could ever penetrate them. And then she had appeared in a storm, this woman with sad eyes and quiet strength and a dignity that shame and misfortune had failed to diminish, and she had undone him utterly without even trying, had found cracks in his defenses he had not known existed, and filled them with light and warmth, and something terrifyingly close to hope. His voice grew rougher as he confessed that he loved her not as duty demanded, not as their arrangement of convenience might suggest, but with every fractured piece of his supposedly frozen heart, loved her intelligence and her kindness and her courage, loved the way she had transformed his cold house into a home, loved the way she looked at him as though she saw not the fearsome stone duke, but simply a man worthy of her regard, and he asked nothing of her in return, save honesty, for he would rather know the truth of her feelings, whatever they might be, than continue in uncertainty. Eleanor felt the tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them, warm trails of emotion that she did not attempt to hide from the man standing before her with his heart laid bare, and she found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to reply, the words pouring forth from some wellspring deep within her that had waited all her life for this precise moment to overflow. She told him that she had never expected to find love, had abandoned such fanciful hopes on the night when Reginald's cruelty had taught her that she was not the sort of woman men cherished, had resigned herself to a life of practical arrangements and quiet contentment at best, and then she had knocked on his door in desperation and found herself face to face with a man whom the world called stone, but whom she had come to know as something far more precious, a man of hidden depths and unexpected tenderness, a man who remembered her favorite poet and sent physicians without being asked, and held her while she wept without demanding anything in return. And she loved him with an intensity that frightened her and exhilarated her in equal measure, loved not the Duke of Thornwood but Alexander, simply Alexander, with all his wounds and walls and the beautiful, battered heart he had just offered to her keeping. The sound that escaped Alexander's throat was something between a laugh and a sob, relief and joy, and disbelief tangling together in a single exhalation, and then he was reaching for her, his hands cradling her face with a gentleness that belied their strength, his thumbs brushing away her tears as though they were precious things, and he kissed her tentatively at first, a question rather than a claim. And when she answered by rising on her toes and pressing closer, the kiss deepened into something that stole Eleanor's breath and set her blood singing in her veins, tender and passionate and achingly perfect beneath the doorway where fate had first brought her to him on a night of storms and desperation. That evening, as twilight painted Thornwood Hall in shades of amber and rose, Alexander led Eleanor to the chambers they had shared in name only since their wedding day, and this time when the door closed behind them, there were no barriers remaining between them, no walls of propriety or pretense or self-protection, only two souls who had found in each other the home they had ceased to believe existed, and Eleanor discovered that passion was not the overwrought sentiment of novels, but something far more profound. A joining of bodies that was simultaneously a joining of hearts, a physical expression of emotional truth that left her trembling and whole, and more herself than she had ever been. And Alexander, the man who had sworn never to love again, discovered that his heart was not the shattered ruin he had believed it to be, but rather a vessel that had been waiting, empty and patient, for the right person to fill it with light. And as he held Eleanor in the darkness afterward, her head pillowed on his chest and her fingers tracing idle patterns across his skin, he understood at last that some vows were not meant to be kept forever, that sometimes breaking a promise to oneself was not weakness but wisdom, not betrayal but becoming, and that the woman in his arms had given him back something he thought he had buried in twin graves 5 years ago, the capacity for joy. The weeks that followed, their confession transformed Thornwood Hall in ways both subtle and profound, for love, once acknowledged, could not be contained or hidden, and it spilled forth from Eleanor and Alexander in glances and touches and small intimacies that the household staff observed with knowing smiles and warm approval. And when the invitation arrived for the Christmas ball hosted by the Countess of Pemberton, the most anticipated event of the winter season, Eleanor felt none of the anxiety that had plagued her before the autumn ball, for she would enter that glittering assembly not as a woman seeking acceptance, but as one who had already found something far more precious than society's approval. And Alexander, watching her read the invitation with quiet confidence rather than trepidation, felt his heart swell with pride at the remarkable woman who had somehow chosen to love him despite every wall he had erected against such vulnerability. The night of the ball arrived crisp and clear, frost glittering on the grounds of Thornwood Hall like scattered diamonds as their carriage departed, and Eleanor wore a gown of deep emerald velvet that complemented the auburn highlights in her hair, the sapphire necklace Alexander had given her resting against her throat like a promise made visible. And when they entered the Countess's magnificent ballroom, conversation did not cease so much as shift, transforming from the suspicious whispers that had greeted them months ago into something altogether different: curiosity. Yes, but also wonder, for the change in the Duke of Thornwood was immediately apparent to anyone with eyes to see. The harsh lines of his face softened by an expression that could only be called contentment, his hand resting at the small of his wife's back with a possessiveness that spoke not of ownership but of cherishing. And when he looked at Eleanor, which he did frequently, and without apparent awareness that he was doing so, his grey eyes held a warmth that made the matrons whisper behind their fans that they had never seen the like in all their years of observing society's machinations. They danced together as the orchestra played a waltz, and Eleanor felt as though she were floating, held securely in Alexander's arms, while the candlelight cast golden shadows across the polished floor, and she was aware of eyes upon them, curious eyes, envious eyes, approving eyes, but she found she cared nothing for any of them, for her world had narrowed to this man who guided her through the steps with unexpected grace, who bent his head to murmur something in her ear that made her laugh with genuine delight, who looked at her as though she were the only woman in the room, in the world, in existence. From across the ballroom, Lady Blackwood watched with an expression that mingled longing and bitterness in equal measure, her costly gown and elaborate jewels failing to disguise the unhappiness that had settled into the lines around her mouth, and beside her Lord Reginald stood with the dissolution of excessive drink beginning to show in his florid complexion, his attention fixed on a young widow with more beauty than sense, while his wife's humiliation played out for all to see. And Eleanor felt not triumph, but something closer to pity, for she understood now that Reginald's rejection had not been her tragedy, but her salvation. The door that closed so painfully, having led her eventually to the door of Thornwood Hall, and the man who had become her heart's true home. The Countess herself approached them between dances, her shrewd eyes taking their measure, and she declared in a voice calculated to carry that the Duke of Thornwood and his Duchess were the handsomest couple of the season, that their obvious devotion was a credit to the institution of marriage, and that she expected to see them at every gathering henceforth, and Alexander accepted this pronouncement with grace, while Eleanor smiled and thanked their hostess. And later that evening, as toast after toast was raised in their honor, and society welcomed the Duchess of Thornwood as one of their own, Eleanor leaned close to her husband and whispered that she was ready to go home, and the smile Alexander gave her in response, tender and heated and full of promise, confirmed what everyone present had already concluded, that the Stone Duke had been thoroughly and irrevocably thawed, and that the quiet woman who had accomplished this feat was perhaps the most fortunate lady in England, though those who knew them well understood that the fortune flowed equally in both directions. 5 years had passed since that stormy night when Eleanor first knocked on the door of Thornwood Hall, and the transformation wrought upon the estate in that time was nothing short of miraculous. For where once cold silence had reigned and shadows had gathered in neglected corners, now warmth and light and the irrepressible sounds of childhood filled every room and corridor, and the nursery that had stood sealed for so long, that shrine to grief and loss that Alexander had believed would never open again, now overflowed with life in the form of 3 children who had inherited their father's dark hair and their mother's intelligent eyes, young Edward, the heir, who at 4 years old already displayed his father's serious demeanor, tempered by flashes of his mother's gentle humor, and the twin daughters, Charlotte and Margaret, who at 2 years of age were a whirlwind of golden laughter and chubby fingers, forever reaching for butterflies in their mother's beloved gardens, and Eleanor often paused in her tending of those gardens, which had become renowned throughout the county for their beauty and abundance, to watch her husband on the great lawn, the fearsome Stone Duke reduced to crawling on hands and knees while his daughters climbed upon his back, and his son commanded imaginary armies with a stick sword, and in those moments her heart swelled with a gratitude so profound it bordered on pain, gratitude for the storm that had broken her carriage wheel, for the courage that had propelled her trembling feet toward those imposing doors, for the man who had opened them and, without knowing it, had opened the door to a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. The estate prospered under their joint stewardship, for Eleanor had proven herself as capable in matters of management as she was in matters of the heart, and Alexander had discovered that sharing his burdens with a true partner made them lighter rather than diminished his authority, and the servants, many of whom had served through the dark years and remembered the master's frozen grief, spoke of the Duke and Duchess with genuine affection and loyalty that exceeded mere employment, for they had witnessed the miracle of love's restoration and counted themselves fortunate to serve a household where happiness was not performed, but truly felt. In the east wing of the great house, a new library had been constructed and dedicated to the memory of Eleanor's father, its shelves lined with volumes of philosophy and poetry that he had loved, a quiet sanctuary where Eleanor often retreated to feel close to the man whose memory she honored and whose final months had been eased by the security Alexander had provided without ever being asked, and sometimes Alexander found her there with tears on her cheeks, and he would simply sit beside her and take her hand, offering the same wordless comfort she had once offered him in the rain beside the family cemetery, for they had learned that love was not only passion and joy, but also the sharing of sorrows, the holding of space for grief, the steady presence that said without words that no burden need be carried alone. Their love had not merely endured but deepened with each passing season, weathering the challenges that came with building a family and managing a vast estate, growing richer through the small daily acts of kindness and consideration that spoke louder than any grand declaration. And when they lay together in the darkness of their chamber, bodies intertwined and hearts beating in comfortable synchrony, they often marveled at the improbable path that had led 2 broken souls to find wholeness in each other. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of amber, and rose as Eleanor and Alexander walked together through the grounds of Thornwood Hall, their children racing ahead of them across the manicured lawn with the boundless energy that only the very young possess. Edward leading his sisters in some elaborate game of his own devising, while their laughter echoed across the estate like music, and Eleanor paused to watch them, her hand resting in the crook of Alexander's arm, her heart so full she wondered that it did not overflow, and she found her thoughts drifting backward through the years to that terrible stormy night when she had stood at these very doors, soaked and shivering and desperate, a woman who had lost everything, her engagement, her reputation, her family's fortune, and very nearly her hope, never imagining, never daring to dream, that she was not approaching her destruction but her deliverance, that the imposing doors of Thornwood Hall would open not merely to offer shelter from the rain, but to welcome her into a life richer and more beautiful than any she had ever envisioned for herself, and she turned to look at the man beside her, this man who had seemed carved from stone when first they met, whose grey eyes had held nothing but winter, whose heart he had declared frozen beyond any thawing, and she marvelled at the journey that had brought them from that first cold meeting to this golden evening, from strangers bound by convenience to lovers bound by choice, from two broken souls who had abandoned hope to two whole hearts, beating as one. Alexander caught her gaze and understood, as he always seemed to understand her thoughts without need for words, and he raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing, and he said quietly that he had sworn never to love again, that he had believed his heart buried in that small grave beside his first wife, that he had constructed walls so high and so thick that he thought them impenetrable, and yet she had knocked on his door in a storm, and somehow, without force or demand or anything but her own gentle presence, she had found every crack in his defenses, had slipped through every barrier, had made him feel again when he had been certain feeling was forever beyond him, and he understood now that some vows were made to be broken, that some walls were built only so the right person could tear them down, that the heart he thought dead had merely been waiting for her, for this life, for these children whose voices rang out across the twilight like bells. And so their story closes, dear listener, not with an ending but with a continuation, for Eleanor and Alexander's love story did not conclude with confession or consummation or even the birth of their children, but goes on still, written fresh each morning in shared glances and clasped hands, and the thousand small kindnesses that comprise a life built together, and perhaps their tale offers this gentle reminder that love finds us not when we seek it most desperately, but often when we have ceased to seek it at all, that the doors we fear to knock upon may open onto our greatest happiness, that hearts we believe forever frozen may yet learn to beat again with warmth and joy and passion, and that sometimes the grandest love stories begin not with a ballroom meeting or a romantic declaration, but with a storm, a broken wheel, and the courage to ask for shelter from a stranger who will not remain strange for long. And we thank you, dear listener, for walking this path with Eleanor and Alexander, for sharing in their sorrows and their joys, and we wish for you the same blessing they found in each other. Love unexpected, love unlooked for, love that heals what was broken and builds what will endure.